She's in there. Are you afraid of a dead horse?
Tywin Lannister's death wasn't a family tragedy. It was a state-sponsored execution. Varys knew that as long as Tywin breathed, the realm stayed standing. And by guiding Tyrion straight to that crossbow, the spider didn't just free a prisoner. He lit the fuse on a power vacuum that would burn Westeros to the ground. Stick with me for the next few minutes, because once you see this scene the way I'm about to show it to you, you will never watch the Season 4 finale the same way again. Here's the thing everybody gets wrong about that night in the Tower of the Hand. We've all been told the same soft, comfortable version of the story. Jaime frees his little brother, tells him Varys has a boat waiting, the two of them share one last hug, and Tyrion is supposed to walk quietly down to the docks and vanish into exile. That's the version that lets us feel good about Varys. Kind old spider, saving a friend out of loyalty. Except that story falls apart the second you actually sit with Varys as a character, book by book, scene by scene. This is a man who spent his entire life in King's Landing gathering secrets like other people gather dust. He built an intelligence network with little birds in every keep from the Wall to Dawn. He served under Aerys the Mad King, then Robert Baratheon, then the boy King Joffrey, switching allegiance every single time the wind changed, and somehow he always landed on his feet. Varys does not do sentiment. Varys does not do impulsive kindness. Every move that man makes is 3 steps ahead of everyone else in the room, including us, the audience, sitting there years later still arguing about what he was really up to. So ask yourself this. Why would the most calculating man in the Seven Kingdoms hand a furious, grieving, humiliated Tyrion Lannister a straight shot at his own father's bedroom, because that's exactly what happens? Jaime tells Tyrion that Varys will get him out of the city, and instead of Tyrion going directly to Varys and the ship, he makes a detour. He climbs up through a secret passage that leads into the Tower of the Hand, the very tower where Tywin lives and sleeps. Now here's a detail people skate right past. In the books, it's Varys himself who reveals that hidden passage to Tyrion much earlier, all the way back in A Clash of Kings, so Shae could be smuggled in and out without Cersei's spies noticing. That tunnel was Varys' gift, Varys' secret, Varys' leverage. He is the one man in the Red Keep who knows that passage leads directly into Tywin's private chambers. Now, if you've read the books closely, you might already be raising an objection here, and it's a fair one. In A Storm of Swords, it isn't presented as Varys volunteering out of some grand master plan. It's Jaime who forces the issue, cornering Varys and pressing a knife to him to make him cooperate. A scene we don't even get in the moment but only learn about later, in a flashback tucked into A Feast for Crows. On the surface, that looks like it undercuts everything I just said. Varys wasn't the architect, he was the man with a blade at his throat. But slow down and look at how Varys actually responds to that pressure, because that's where this gets interesting. A eunuch who built a spy network spanning 2 continents, who survived 3 different kings, who outmaneuvered Peter Baelish at his own game more than once, does not get cornered by anyone unless some part of him is willing to be cornered. Varys had 100 ways to slow Jaime down, delay the escape, alert the guards, protect himself first and worry about Tyrion later. Instead, he moves fast, efficiently, and with a level of preparation that frankly looks less like a man improvising under threat and more like a man who already had a ship chartered and an exit plan drawn up long before Jaime ever showed up with a blade. Being coerced in the moment doesn't mean you weren't already halfway out the door. Sometimes the knife just gives you the excuse you needed. Think about what that means. On the night of the escape, the fastest, quietest, most heavily guarded route out of King's Landing runs directly past the bedroom door of the man Tyrion hates more than anyone alive. A coincidence? In a story built by George R.R. Martin, a writer famous for planting details chapters and even books in advance? I don't buy it for a second, and honestly, once you line up the pieces, I don't think you will either. Let's talk about why Tywin mattered so much in the first place, because this is the part of the theory that people tend to rush past, and it's actually the whole engine of the argument. Tywin Lannister is not just a rich old man barking orders, he is the entire administrative skeleton holding the 7 kingdoms together after Robert's rebellion, after the War of the 5 Kings, after Blackwater turned half the city to ash. The Crown owes staggering debts to the Iron Bank of Braavos. The faith of the 7 has been humiliated and stripped of its old authority. The great houses are exhausted, broke and simmering with resentment toward the Lannisters. for winning a war that left everyone else in ruins. And the only reason any of it holds together is Tywin. His reputation alone functions like a retaining wall. Lords who would happily rebel against a barely grown boy king, or against Cersei's erratic paranoia, think twice when Tywin's name is attached to the throne, because everyone remembers what happened at the Red Wedding, what happened to House Reign of Castamere generations earlier, what happens to people who cross Tywin Lannister. Varys knows all of this better than almost anyone in Westeros, because gathering exactly this kind of information is his entire job. He's not a soldier. He's not a lord with an army. His power comes from understanding the machinery of the realm down to the bolt and screw, and his little birds are how he does it. An army of children and servants planted in kitchens and barracks and bedchambers from Pentos to Winterfell, feeding him whispers that no council meeting ever records. And if you understand the machinery that well, you understand precisely which single bolt, if removed, causes the whole structure to collapse. That bolt is Tywin. Remember too that Tywin isn't just holding the piece together through fear alone. He's the one juggling the crown's actual finances, a debt to the Iron Bank of Braavos so large it eventually becomes a plot point of its own, and a small folk population still recovering from a war that gutted the countryside. Pull Tywin out of that equation and you don't just lose a strong hand on the sword, you lose the only person in the capital who understands how to keep the lights on, the granaries stocked, and the bankers in Braavos from calling in their debts all at once. So picture the calculation from Varys' side. A public execution of Tywin would have made him a martyr, would have rallied the Westerlands and the Crown loyalists into a unified, furious response. Bad outcome for Varys. But a private killing, in a privy, at the hands of his own disgraced son, using the dead boy king's own crossbow, still hanging on his father's wall months after the wedding. That started this whole tragedy. That is something else entirely. That's not martyrdom. That's scandal. That's shame that can never be washed off House Lannister's name. It fractures the family from the inside instead of uniting it from the outside. And notice the layers Varys builds into this. He doesn't march up to Tyrion and say, "Go kill your father." That would be far too obvious, far too easy to trace back to him, and frankly out of character for how the spider operates. Instead, he simply removes every obstacle and lets Tyrion's own rage do the work. He gives Tyrion the passage. He steps back. He lets a broken man who has just watched his own father sentence him to death for a murder he didn't commit, who has just discovered his lover Shay in his father's own bed, walk straight into the one room in the castle where the confrontation was always going to detonate. Tyrion strangles Shay with a chain of small golden hands, the very token he himself had given her back when he was filling in as acting hand of the king, and then he grabs a crossbow off the wall, Joffrey's own crossbow, left hanging there since the boy king's death, and finds his father sitting in the privy. Even the show's dialogue practically writes the thesis for us. Tywin sneers that Tyrion's whole life he's wanted him dead, and admits, almost admiringly, that Tyrion refused to die anyway. Then Tyrion pulls the trigger, and as his father gasps out that he is no son of his, Tyrion answers him with the line that closes out one of the most quietly devastating scenes in the entire series. "I am your son. I have always been your son. That is not the kind of death that creates loyalty. That is the kind of death that creates a curse hanging over an entire house." And Varys is right there for the aftermath. In the show, he's the one who finds Tyrion in the corridor and rushes him away before the guards close in. In the books, Varys is the one who leads Tyrion down through the dungeons to the foot of that ladder, points him toward the passage, and has a ship already waiting to smuggle him across the narrow sea. And here's the detail that ought to stop you cold. Once Tyrion is safely away, Varys simply disappears from the narrative almost entirely for the rest of that book. No farewell speech to Cersei, no report to the small council. He vanishes, mission apparently complete, and doesn't resurface again in the text until far later, in the closing pages of A Dance with Dragons. Ask yourself why a master spy, a man whose entire value depends on staying visible and useful inside the corridors of power, would suddenly go dark right after Tywin's murder unless the murder itself was the job. There's another angle worth sitting with before we move on, and it's one most breakdowns of this scene skip entirely. Compare Tywin's death to every other major assassination in this story. Joffrey dies in front of hundreds of witnesses at his own wedding feast, and the result is chaos, yes, but also a kind of unifying grief that briefly pulls the Lannister-Tyrell alliance closer together as everyone scrambles to find a culprit. Robb Stark dies at the Red Wedding, in a massacre so public and so brutal that it becomes a rallying cry for northern loyalty for years afterward, the exact kind of martyrdom Tywin himself understood and exploited when he planned it. Tywin's own death gets none of that. No feast hall full of witnesses, no song written about it that inspires the small folk to rise up in his name. Just a locked privy, a dead prostitute in the next room, and a story so humiliating that House Lannister spends years trying to bury it rather than avenge it. If you were trying to design the single most demoralizing, least rally-worthy death imaginable for the most powerful man in the realm, you would design exactly this one. That's not bad luck. That's precision. Now here's where the theory pays off, because taking out Tywin isn't the goal, it's the opening move. Look at what actually happens to King's Landing once Tywin is gone. Cersei takes the reins, and almost immediately the city starts rotting from the inside. She elevates the High Sparrow because she thinks she can use the Faith Militant as a weapon against the Tyrells, completely misjudging how quickly that religious movement will spiral out of her control. Margaery gets thrown in a cell. The Tyrells, who represented the single wealthiest and most stable alliance the crown had left, get alienated and eventually devastated. Cersei's paranoia curdles into open tyranny, culminating in the wildfire destruction of the Great Sept of Baelor, an act so extreme it kills the High Sparrow, most of House Tyrell's remaining leadership, her own uncle Kevin, and Cersei's own daughter-in-law Margaery in one stroke. None of that chaos happens with Tywin Lannister still alive and running the small council with his usual iron discipline. Tywin was cold, he was cruel in his own quiet way, but he was competent, and competence was the one thing holding the whole rotten structure upright. Remove the competent tyrant, and what you get is an incompetent one. And an incompetent, paranoid, increasingly hated ruler is exactly the kind of ruler a kingdom eventually rises up against. This is where Varys' long game comes into full view, because the spider was never actually working for the Lannisters, or for Robert, or even really for the idea of peace in the abstract sense he liked to talk about at court. His true allegiance, as the show and the books both eventually confirm, bends toward the Targaryen restoration, first quietly gesturing toward the possibility of Aegon in the books, and openly, unmistakably toward Daenerys Targaryen once he crosses the narrow sea with Tyrion at his side. Once the two of them are holed up together in exile, hiding out at Illyrio Mopatis' estate in Pentos, Varys finally tells Tyrion the truth. He's been working toward putting a proper ruler on the throne for a very long time, and Daenerys might finally be that ruler. That's not a throwaway line, that's a confession. And here's the part that makes the whole theory click into place. A saviour narrative doesn't work if the kingdom is doing fine. Nobody welcomes a foreign queen with dragons and an army of Unsullied if the Seven Kingdoms are stable, well-governed and loyal to the family already sitting the throne. You need collapse first. You need the people exhausted, frightened and desperate for literally anyone else. Varys needed King's Landing to break. He needed the Lannister regime to eat itself alive from the throne room outward. And the fastest possible way to start that unravelling wasn't a battle, wasn't an assassin's blade in a crowded hall. It was one quiet, shameful killing in a privy, committed by the victim's own son, orchestrated by a man who never once had to lift a weapon himself. So when you rewatch that scene now, watch Varys' face in the doorway. He doesn't look surprised the way a bystander looks surprised. He looks like a man confirming that a plan has worked, and that single look might be the most honest moment the show ever gives us about who Varys actually is, underneath the humble servant act he performs for 7 straight seasons. That's the theory. Varys didn't save Tyrion out of friendship. He turned Tyrion's grief into the sharpest weapon he had, aimed it at the one pillar holding the whole rotten kingdom upright, and then quietly stepped back to watch the realm burn down so that something new could eventually rise out of the ashes. Whether you buy every piece of it or just the outline, it's hard to unsee once you've walked through the evidence step by step the way we just did. Tell me in the comments if you think the Spider is the most underrated mastermind in the entire series, or if I'm giving Varys way too much credit for what was honestly just Tyrion's own rage catching up with him. Either way, if this kind of deep dive is your thing, hit subscribe, because there are a lot more hidden threads in this story still waiting to be pulled.